Hi, everybody. This is Kevin Sabourin, your host of the Channel Chatter podcast. This week, we're going to dive into the world of transformational leadership with the incredible Gary Lancina. With decades of experience in consulting, startups, and building high-trust teams, Gary is here to share his secrets in navigating career pivots, harnessing the power of what we like to call weaponizing empathy, and creating opportunities that truly align with one's passions. So from bridging generational work styles to turning failures into growth moments, Gary's insights are a must hear for leaders, sales pros, and anybody looking to elevate their game. Plus, his unique concept on finding one's quote unquote sandbar of sanity will help you stay grounded no matter what the challenge. So if you're ready to rethink leadership and career success, this episode's probably for you. So let's get started, shall we? Gary, how does somebody decide whether they're going to get into consulting or not? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a personal choice for anybody who's contemplating it. And I think you've got to be realistic about what comes with it. If you're early in your career, you come out of B school and you join a big consulting firm, essentially the heavy lifting in terms of business development and what you're going to be working on is done by others. But for folks of a certain vintage, kind of like where I'm at, I've got enough gray hair now to qualify. The choice really comes down to some trade-offs and some considerations. And I generally start with a set of sort of considerations at any phase in my career where I might be contemplating a change. What are my needs? What is existential that I've got to fulfill? Got to pay the mortgage, got to pay taxes, et cetera. That sort of sets a baseline. But then the second phase, and probably an even more important consideration, is what do I love? What do I want to do? And alternately, what do I want to not do because it's soul crushing? That starts to lay fence lines on opportunities and provides me the ability when I'm networking to say, here's kind of what I aspire to do. Here's what I really don't want to do. In my case, my party trick for a long time has been transformation to unlock growth. Whether that's a startup or it's a turnaround or it's a mature business that's just feeling a little stale. I'm not an industry specific guy. And so I'll go places and I love that. I love it when somebody says, we've got a problem we can't figure out. And just digging into that, building the teams, buy-in around that, building a high trust culture. That's on the what I want to do. And then, there are a handful of things what I don't want to do. I'm not the kind of person who thrives when told these are the tasks and here's how I want you to do the tasks. That sort of repetition or sort of straitjacket, it starts to feel stifling to me, and I've met myself. So, I try to stay out of those circumstances. So you got this sort of, what are my needs? What do I want to do? What do I not want to do? And then, a third element here is to then be thinking about what problems are out there that we can solve, and for which of those am I optimal or distinctively capable? Because I'm guessing this applies to you. I'm familiar a little bit with your background, Kevin. You can do a lot of stuff. And the question is, where are you at your best? And where, in terms of a fit with whether it's clients or a hiring organization, are you at your best and delivering value that is exceptional? And the reason that I like thinking in those sort of phases, whether for consulting or for finding a leadership position within an organization, they put in the facets of optimizing the power of your network. The sharper you are on this is the problem I want to solve, this is what I love to do, the more all of your connections pre-filter for you, they pre-screen. So instead of getting 40 different, links to open positions on LinkedIn, people are like, no, that's not right for Kevin. This is a better one. And so you attune your network and it gives you an amplification that's really meaningful. And bringing that back to the consultative space, sometimes, and I think this can happen in terms of one's own inclinations or just sort of a reality about how to put together a fruitful career phase. The problem that each of us solves may not be one that lots of organizations say, well, we've got a role for that, right? There are very few organizations that say we've got a brand turnaround, vice presidency. But what they do have is a portfolio of brands and a handful of them that are underperforming. And so they need help. And so that same process of saying, well, here's the kind of problem I can solve might mean that you go in and spend a bit of time helping them think strategically about it, or put the game plan together and start the implementation, or coach the team. And so those types of engagements can make for a very fruitful consultative career path. And now you're solving problems that give you intellectual stimulation and satisfaction, and you're finding a way to make a living at it without requiring an organization to go through gyrations to create a position for you that might be temporary or too narrow to actually last, right? And I think we all hear the stories of somebody stepping into a space being told this is what you need to get done, and then 2-3 years later it's like, well, that job's done now what? They're back out looking again.
I really love the way you position that. So I was envisioning you at the beginning of this hockey stick upward angle, like, as a sort of this, maybe not brand turnaround, but this transitional moment. And I've seen you in action to know that you're the impetus for like launching into a new trajectory. So I could totally relate to that. That activity lights me up. I tend to thrive in a startup world very, very well because that multifacetedness is leaned on heavily. The more mature the organization gets, the more role segmented, the more lane you're in, kind of like the less interest I have, right? I navigated really successfully in over a 10-year stretch when I was with the Toro Company. Love the Toro Company, great people, huge company at the time. They were a couple billion. They're way larger now, but way back then they were already still a big company. But what I did while I was there was I changed jobs 5 times. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And each one of
Yeah.
these was kind of this like upwardly angled, sort of unusual thing that I was doing for them that hadn't been done before. But I was on the other side of the fence. I was in the family. And once I was in the family and they saw the value I would add, they just took my unique combination of skill sets and said, yeah, do a little bit more of that. So they could take a title and kind of bend it a little bit. But I love what you said about like, nobody says in a portfolio of brands, we need the brand turnaround specialist, VP of brand turnaround or whatever. But your insight about finding a portfolio where a couple of weak links maybe could use some immediate improvement, boy, that hits the mark for me. So if you come across that job, I'm in. I'm interested in that job.
All right. Well, I'll let you know. I've had, in my career, I've done big companies with, multi-billion-dollar global businesses. I've done startups. I've done a couple of private equity-backed turnarounds. When I was working for a little company called BP, at that point, I had the good fortune to do some very meaningful work with product management, with marketing communications, data and analytics and insights, and partnering with the sales team, and felt really good about it. And at a certain point, I felt like I had accomplished what I needed to do. And I actually went and proposed a restructure of my own team to my boss and eliminated my role. Now, in doing that, and this I think gets to your inclination around a startup, BP being what it was, I had identified a need and said, as I eliminate this, how about we create a role over here? I think we would benefit if we went into this innovation and partnership space. And right now we've got nobody focused on that. And so I created my own little startup initiative inside that corporate umbrella. So it doesn't always mean you've got to leave and go move to Silicon Valley and chase venture capital. You can do stuff like this inside a corporate structure. And at the same time, you can at times maybe say, you know what, I believe in myself. I'm going to actually go hang a shingle out and I'm going to be a consultant. I've got enough of a network. I know there's needs out there, and you hustle and see what happens. And, again, I've been fortunate because I've been able to sort of pace my career where I came out of business school. I went into consulting. I then went into line management, worked for a couple of very solid companies, cut my teeth on good process and procedure and some of the specialization you were talking about. Then I went and did some more consulting. Then I went back into corporate roles, and I'm at a phase now where I'm thinking, okay, so what's the next thing for me? Is it another corporate leadership position? Do I want to go be a C-level with an enterprise of these characteristics? Or do I listen to the folks who are saying, hey, we could use you as an executive coach. I had a friend recently, CEO of a company in the Chicago area, who said, I'd love to have you as a board member. And so,
Hmm.
as we go through our career, and I think this is something maybe your audience, would relate to, we always have inputs. There's some recruiter who calls you up. There's somebody you see at lunch. You hear from a cousin or a former colleague who says we've got needs, and it's that ability to kind of constantly reevaluate the screening criteria and say, okay, is this something where I think it feeds what I need and want? Is it feeding what I love to do? Do I think I would be adding value there? Is it distinctive enough where it's like, I'm going to step in and they're going to appreciate what I do and how I do it, right? And those filtering criteria, they're always there. They're always lurking. And then every once in a while, we give them a harder look, maybe tweak them a little bit and move forward.
My kids and I and my wife, we talk about things like must-haves and nice-to-haves, and that's sort of an underlying criteria. Like, Dad, you get up and you do this job, and there's like travel involved, or there's whatever things, and and do you love all of it, or do you love some of it? Do you love most of it, or whatever? And I kind of usually back that conversation down to the must-haves in our life, the things that are non-negotiables in our world, in our family, in our nucleus. Those things financially come at a consequence of X. And once that's satisfied, then all these other nice to have things can also be had. Well, in rarely is there like sort of, in my opinion, like a perfect model of work tasks that also need to be done. But to the greatest degree possible, if I can reduce the amount of things that I get embroiled in that don't feed my soul and maximize the things that do feed my soul, then I'm a happier person overall.
Yeah.
So I kind of have that sort of perspective also, like what do I want to do that really lights me up? And I'm really glad you're bringing these things to light. It's a great time for me on this. Before recording today, I shared a short story with you about my son and his awareness that he wanted to become a cirque performer. Those of you following the program have heard me talk a little bit about this in the past. I haven't talked a lot about it, but there was a pivotal day, and it was day one when he went to this gym that my wife introduced him to, and he climbed a rope and he went to the top of this building, and it was like 30 feet in the air. And as he's hanging up there in this rope, he's looking around and he sees people having fun in physical pursuits with creative expression. I will add layers to this that he wasn't able to articulate at the time. In physical pursuits with creative expression, these people who were inclined to take good care of their bodies and had a great, sort of a fitness focused lifestyle, he witnessed them having fun. And he said to me specifically, they had more fun than most adults, and they were actually training to do their job. They weren't even doing their job. Dad, that's what I want to do when I grow up. And I like,
Yeah.
really? That's awesome to have
Yeah.
that kind of insight. By the way, at 9, okay, so now he's 19 and he's being trained by some professionals at Cirque du Soleil, which is super cool. And his 15, almost 16-year-old sister is teamed up with him, and together they're going to be in an act. To have that sort of clarity and visibility and stick-to-itiveness and discipline to actually drive towards that goal, I think is admirable for most of us, at my age in my career. I'd love to have that sort of focus and be able to articulate that. And they brought it to me with this wisdom from a decade ago, and I love that. So that's my Kieran hanging on the rope story, and from Cirque, and tying it back to must-haves and nice-haves. There, I'm leading towards a question. And I know there's a lot of detail here for you. It has to do with I have fan of the book StrengthsFinders, and I can recite my, yeah, I love it. You're good. You too. I can recite my attributes. And I was introduced to this way back when I was at Toro in like maybe 2002 or three. The executive VP gave us the book and was a friend of Marcus Buckingham and the Gallup Institute and all that. So what I learned in my decade with Toro is that I found a way to apply the attributes that came very natural to me. And I did
Hmm.
it almost no matter what role I was in. So this is where it leads to the question about, you back into it, or do you just stick with your attributes? Because I'm a communicator, an ideation person, a strategist, I relate to people as a relator, and I receive input, which is kind of like a collector of all things that would inspire me. I take that unique constellation of attributes and I apply it to where I go. So one of the most fun and successful paths in my career, the stop was when I was managing corporate accounts, because I took our most important customers, and without a script, because there wasn't one, I listened to them very intently to understand what they were trying to accomplish. I used my strategy brain to see all the different pathways to make it happen. I used my communication skills to not only keep them feeling appreciated, but to introduce these new concepts to the corporation. And I was able to navigate this path. And I really look back at it was me allowing myself to utilize my attributes was how I could add value. I could have been a rock concert promoter, I think, or I could have been a lawnmower salesman to oversimplify the gig. But it was about utilizing those attributes. You know what I mean? So that's when I feel like I'm in my sweet spot. How about you?
Yeah,
Do you relate to that, or do you see that differently?
I do. I think, it's interesting thinking about the story of your 9-year-old, now 19-year-old. At 9 years old, I wanted to do everything. I wanted to be a rock star, professional athlete, artist, scientist, Supreme Court judge, right? The list was pretty long. And I'm still trying to figure out specifically what I want to do. So, I've been able to put a goal in mind at several points in my life, right? I was an athlete in college, so I made it to that level. I wanted to play in bands. I picked up guitar, and I joined a couple of bands over the years. I really sparked when I was in graduate school to this idea of marketing for the variety and the intellectual stimulation that went with it. And I have a pretty broad view of what marketing is. It includes product management and communications and other things. So I couple the idea of having clarity and focus with an ability to maintain some level of optionality, because I think the idea of being capable and knowing what we're good at allows us to make choices and decisions. And sometimes there are things that come out of left field, a problem, a task force, an opportunity, a community need that resonates. And having the ability to sort of pivot and leverage your strengths and take advantage of what you're really good at in almost a spontaneous mode sometimes is not a bad thing. Now, I say spontaneous, not impulsive, because I think if we get impulsive, we lose the thread, right? And then we're bouncing around and we're not clear. But every once in a while, there's sort of a need to be quick to react when an opportunity or a challenge arises. That's just as important as being proactive and mindful in planning kind of how things are going to go. I sat down yesterday with a friend of mine who's the CEO of a Boys and Girls Club, right? And they play a big role, not just in an individual facility, but they've got a presence in all of the schools in the city where they are. They're talking about expanding and filling out sort of a regional play and creating more satellite locations. And he's very thoughtful about this. And we talked about the benefits and the challenges of long-term planning. And, part of his challenge is long-term plans get laid down, he said, but they're kind of obsolete pretty quickly because they're never exactly right. And I said, well, I always look at them as kind of a vector. You make a choice on the direction you're going to go, but you're constantly reevaluating. Sometimes you redirect, sometimes you recommit and keep going, but it's still helpful to look downfield. And I think where you were kind of leading is sometimes you've got real clarity and it's almost linear what your path is. This is what I want to do. Here are the strengths that I've got to leverage and build, and I'm just going for it. And for some of us, that works. At other times, life happens while we're busy making other plans, and something arises, and then we're at a fork in the road. And the ability to choose which path really comes back to a sense of whether it's StrengthsFinders or feedback from others or a sense of just internal calibration and balance, to be able to say, in this moment, which path forward is right for me.
I love it. It's not often I quote Mike Tyson, and this may be the only time, but I do like when he says everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. That one stood out. It's great to have a plan. I come more from the Stephen Covey variety of planning in this sense that like when my wife and I, she read his 7 Habits book and long ago I did as well. But then she took it a step further and read the one for the family. And I thought that was really cool. And there's an early passage in the book that describes, I think it's a cross country flight from like LA to Boston. And you have these two plots at the beginning, and you have an estimated route, and you have a path, and then you have to adjust based on altimeter and wind and all, storms and all these things. But you still have this destination in mind, and you're all on the plane together, right? You don't know what's necessarily going to blow you off course, but there is a vision, right? And we talked a little earlier about sort of, family and stuff and the vision for like where I'm going sort of in my career. There's been this movement to more of a consultation, more of a consultative approach, less of a feature and benefit. I think hopefully like everybody in sales is kind of doing that. You don't want it to be sort of cliche, but it's like if I'm going to be in sales and I'm going to engage with people, the only way for it to add value to me is I have to hear you. I have to understand you. I want to get to know your stories. And frankly, the whole reason I'm doing a podcast is because I've been doing discovery work on people for years, finding out what makes you tick and what interests you. And along the way, I've had over 3 decades of fascinating stories being shared with me of people that I always thought the world should get to know better or in this unique way. Let me coax out a story that will add value to somebody else. And frankly, I guess I'm really playing right now, honestly. But in this playing,
That's the joy, man.
that's the joy.
So this is a sweet spot for you, Kevin, and I've known you for
Right.
years, right? This is a sweet spot for you. You get a thrill and a sense of contentment out of engaging with people and listening and processing and playing it back. The intellectual exchange is good for you. And if I were to sort of extrapolate from that, I would say that forms a foundation from which your brain starts to build connections and say, well, how might we think about this? I know you've got this business problem to solve. So when we were at Mercury Marine, how might we support our dealers better? And how might we create opportunities and at the same time have them feel a real affinity towards the Mercury brand? And the program we put together, I think it was 4-6 weeks before the dealers started sending feedback in saying this is the best thing Mercury's ever done for us.
Yeah, totally.
I frequently write on whiteboards, with my teams, a little
As you do.
2-word sentiment that is
Right.
weaponize empathy,
Ooh,
right?
I'm
And
writing it down.
the reason that I like that is because the better we understand the people we serve, the better we can serve them. And that can be differentiated. In a world where people are competing to sell paper clips, right? One of the least differentiated products on earth. The competitive differentiation factor gets shifted away from the product attribute to service attributes. And I think we've all experienced, whether it's at a retailer or in a hospitality circumstance or in a business to business sense, the moment when bad service creates an opportunity for a competitor, or great service and the commitment inside that relationship creates resilience to the cross sell. And so it's fundamental for me to be empathetic. To be empathetic to my customers, to be empathetic to their customers, because for anybody in a B2B space, oftentimes what we're providing to the people who pay us money is something that should be additive to their value proposition to the people who pay them money. And so again, you can just start building layers on that to say the more I've got insight here and an appreciation of not just the nuts and bolts, but also the sentiment, the feelings, the hassle factors, the fears, the better I can build an offer suite that is tailored and drives, value and growth and long-term, committed high value exchanges.
Good friend of mine, John Strzelecki from Orlando, Florida, is a very accomplished author, best-selling global whatever, and business writer. And he tells a story of a paperclip and how a person turned a paperclip into, I think, a Cadillac. I kid you not. But there's this documented trail of exchanges of bartering where he upwardly bartered what started with a paperclip and ended up with like I'm making this part up. I'll have to look it up and put it in the show notes, but it's like a Cadillac Coupe de Ville or something. And I think it was used. I don't know if it was new, but I don't know if it matters because a paperclip somehow became a Cadillac, right? So even in the most like sort of benign or inconsequential sort of, sorry to my paperclip selling friends, but assets, you know what I mean? Something most of us don't get excited about throughout the day. To look at that differently, blur the lens a little bit and move back. I like to say the 40,000 foot view of things. If I could hold two positions in life and the one is in the moment where I'm focused and hopefully in the flow, and then periodically coming up an altitude where I see it from above, kind of hover over it and look out, basically to the horizon line, or 5 miles, or 5 years in the distance. Like those, I don't know what the ratio of time spent at one or the other should be, but in the flow, as long as you're in the flow, I think, and then pop up periodically and get a view of the horizon line. One of the things that I kind of try to hold true is to stay in that space, because I really am a big believer in flow. And I don't think flow happens when you're doing, mind numbing, painful things. I think it happens when you're in your groove. So I have a question for you. A person I met recently, Christina Brady, has a really cool company out of Chicago called Luster AI. And it's basically sales training where they replicate a persona through AI, and you're practicing on this persona. And one of the things that popped out of that conversation with me was when she talked about, in my mind, I heard introvert. Okay. And you're talking to an introvert, and I think she used like a disc analysis and she called it a certain letter type or whatever. And I forget what that was, but basically described it. You and I clearly extroverts, or at least leaning extrovert, right? No, not you. You're bashful.
No, I am a gregarious introvert.
Interesting. So I
This
am also a
this is
sensitive.
good for me. One-on-one, fantastic. And you can put me on stage and I'll deliver a great presentation. But if you put me into a ballroom with 1,000 people, I'll be
Yes.
the guy in the corner watching everybody else.
Fascinating. Okay. I too am a relator, back to StrengthsFinder. So I will work the room as necessary as part of my job, but it doesn't fuel me. The moment that necessity is over, I'm back to the cluster of 5 or 6 or whatever people that have actually developed relationship. So I too am a centrist, capable of either, and I'm just right of the center line on the extroversion side. But I'm not an extrovert. You know what I mean? But I also don't need to go like into a quiet hidey hole to recharge. And I don't mean that disrespectfully to my introvert friends. My son has a superpower of being able to do that. Just like take a 10 minutes in his room with a book or whatever, and bang, comes out like a new human being. Mine is more physical. I, tend to take a walk in the sunlight or do something like that. But anyway, the persona and the question. So boy, I don't want to get too far away because I'll lose my point. But she fascinated me with the difference in personas and what lights us up. So in other people, when I, as a salesperson, when I'm trying to engage, I have a new view after all these years of there isn't, yeah, I've always known there's a recipe. And maybe here's what I think I know is that everybody appreciates feeling heard and or listened to and or replaying whatever they told you, whether they're an introvert or an extrovert. If you close the loop and tell them, here's what I heard you say, I feel like that lands universally for across humanity. That is just a good skill set to have. The chit chat on the way in lands with somebody who needs to get to know you before they're willing to open themselves up to a conversation. The chit chat with a different personality type is like, oh, this guy's wasting my time right from the get go. And I start to lose stock. You know what I mean? So you've worked for a lot of different companies with a lot of different people. You've engaged a lot of different senior management. How do you navigate, given those different archetypes? How do you see adding value in all the multitude of different environments when you're doing these startups and stuff?
Well, it's interesting, Kevin. I think in some cases it's part of that leveraging of empathy.
Mm,
So I'll give you a for instance. A prior organization, marketing was construed as kind of a black mystery box.
hmm
The C-level leaders knew that they needed a marketing group. They knew that they spent money on it, but they really didn't understand what was going on. They didn't understand the value of it. And in that instance, the opportunity was not to defend what marketing was up to or tell them, or imply that they were, let's say, lacking insight. And so what we did is we took the marketing group and I said, listen, the people who run this company are operators. We're going to use their vocabulary to describe what we do and create a bridge that's more understandable. And in doing so, we're going to open up this black box and there's going to be transparency. So we adopted terms like demand, throughput, cycle time to finish, quality, backlog, all the things that, are vocabulary terms that somebody on a manufacturing line would be comfortable with. And we were able to demonstrate that we had increasing demand on the marketing team. and constrained capacity, and that we were facing trade-offs in terms of timeliness and quality. And what I would say, bringing it back to your question, is in terms of listening and really being present in the early conversations. One of the superpowers humans have is we can make inferences pretty quickly. You don't want to jump to conclusions and get set in them, because you can continue to learn and evolve your perception. But understanding and appreciating what's truly important to somebody. Don't walk in so convinced of what you need to convey that you're not perceiving what's important to the person you're serving. And I'll bring this back to a very concrete example. We've all experienced, and probably more than we like, being in a setting with a group of other people and somebody's presenting, and it is clear that their presentation is an exercise in reading what's on the slide that's on the screen, and then getting to the next slide and getting through all that content, and then getting to the next slide, right? And it starts to feel like, wait a minute, the content up there is not what we're here to do. We're here to either learn or make some choices or provide feedback. We should be involved and engaged in dialogue. And so that one-sided sort of, I'm going to just drill you with what I'm here to say, gets in the way of being able to, and this goes back to this sort of vectoring idea, right? Being able to perceive that maybe I walked into the room thinking we've got to solve problem X, and in reality, problem Y is more important and more urgent. So the comfort to sort of say, to your point, here's what I've heard, here's what I'm perceiving. Check in. How is that? Are we aligned? Yes. Okay. Well, based on that, I don't think we need the slide deck right now. I think we need to talk about this other topic. And that doesn't always work. Sometimes people are like, no, I want to hear what you got. But again, it's recognizing that, we're social critters as humans. And to optimize the value of interactions in a social sense, we can't just give or shoot out. We've also got to take in and receive. And it's that, for me, that's a fundamental, because ultimately for me, marketing is about relationships, establishing and nurturing high loyalty or commitment relationships within which we exchange things of value. I may be offering you a service or a product and you're giving me some of your hard-earned cash, but it's still valuable on both sides. And if we can do that, where we both feel like this is fair, we're getting what we need, and it's easy to do business with one another. Ideally, that just creates growth, and it broadens the pipe, and it puts solid barriers around it to defend, competitive incursions. That's what we want. And it can apply one-on-one. It can apply in terms of enterprise to enterprise. That's kind of how I approach it. I don't know if that was the long way around the barn or it kind of got to your topic, but that's how
it was a much better question than it was or a much better answer than it was a question. That's what I tried to say. I packed a lot into that for you, and you did a great job with it. One of my second, I think, interview was with Gerhard Geschwantner, and he's the CEO of Selling Power Magazine, and also the organization who does the Sales 3.0 conference. And I really appreciated it because I got a chance to go to one here that was in Vegas, and it was focused on CRO, the title CRO, and what that job space looks like, which is kind of where I'm going in my career, and AI and how to utilize AI. And I was really fascinated by that. But anyway, Gerhard, during his conference, he was talking about, I asked him afterwards, what do you say to the young salespeople entering this space? Because there's so much sales training focused on these sort of, feels a little bit to me like manipulative tactics to win over the moment. And I understand that we're all trying to gain rapport, and rapport looks different to different personality types, but all these like tonal, inflection, nuance, value prop, how much research I do on you, and all these kind of things. It's really about kind of advancing the relationship to a point where you can add value. I'm like, what do you make of that? How do you not see it as manipulative, or, you know what I mean? If you have a mismatch, like a gregarious, outgoing salesperson and a shy, introverted purchasing clerk, you know what I mean? Like, and those two, they're not going bowling together often, right? So he says, you got to get, his answer to me on that was, been doing it for 40 years. You got to get right with yourself. It's all internal. Do you or do you not believe that you're going to add value? And the rest of it is, and I'm paraphrasing something way more eloquent than this, but it was about getting right with yourself first and knowing that you're going to add value no matter what, and doing whatever that person deems as the pleasantries appropriate to begin the relationship. You can't begin the relationship, you can't add value. But it was really about get that noise out of your head and get right with yourself first. And it takes me back to the early part of our conversation about existential must-haves, nice-to-haves, alignments, what resonates, what doesn't, what's that work-life balance around, and things like that. Getting right with yourself to prepare yourself for what's going to go be fun or what you're
Yeah.
likely to be good at, right?
Yeah.
He taught me a lot about that in that short conversation. Really, really sharp guy. I'm curious, because of all the teams that you've led and all the people that you've met of all sorts of ages, what is this younger demographic? I'm curious your thoughts on how they approach what we've been talking about. This, I guess, work-life balance is probably dated to them. What they're willing to align with, what they're willing to get behind, where they find their resonance, whether or not they commit to joining a team. What's your take on all that?
Well, I'm always wary when we start talking about generational cohorts. I'll say that up front
Mm-hmm.
because I believe it's not a suspicion. I believe firmly
Mm-hmm.
that as human beings, we share a lot more characteristics than differentiate us.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, whether somebody's straight out of school and at the beginning of their career or is a grizzled veteran, I think there are a couple of things that lead to exceptional team performance. And I don't think that they're influenced by how old you are. One is, are we clear on what we're trying to accomplish? And are we aligned around that? Right? If we've got this sense of collective purpose or mission, that is fundamental. Because if we're not clear on that, then we might be working at odds with one another
Yeah.
rather than all pulling in the same direction. The second is a high degree of trust. And I've not met anybody who doesn't appreciate feeling trusted. It's almost a gift to bestow on somebody to ask them for help
Mm.
or to allow them some autonomy to figure some things out. And that combination of clarity of purpose and trust is where magic happens.
Mm-hmm.
I actually just pulled out a book that was written by General McChrystal years ago, and it's called Team of Teams. It's a really good book. I'm not a military guy. What I
Mm-hmm.
found was it was a good book around certain principles of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a couple of chapters in the middle of it that really get to that point. And one chapter is all around this idea of have a sense of mission and high trust.
Mm-hmm.
And it's underpinned by his assertion that there isn't a single human who is so good as to be able to envision all the different things that could arise or all of the different options we might consider to address situations as they arise. That's the power of teams. It's why we have teams. And I've done my own work and research in this space long before he wrote that book, and it was just affirming for me. So I'll start there. I think the reality is that every cohort of people entering the workforce forever has brought with it its own experiences. And I remember being a kid walking around on, the family ranch with my grandparents.
Yeah.
And my grandpa would stop and, look down when there were some gravel roads on the ranch. And he'd look down and he'd pick up like a screw, right? And he'd look at it and he'd stick it in his pocket. And I'm thinking, what's he doing? And, we'd get back to the shop and he had a little old coffee can and he'd put a little gasoline in there and he'd drop the screw in because it's a solvent, right? He'd take the rust off it. And then he had like a little file system where he's like, okay, it's a Phillips screw. It's a wood screw. Okay, it's going in this drawer. He kept everything. But as I got older, I appreciated him growing up during the Great Depression, what his circumstances were, his sense of don't waste anything that might be of value. And, you take that and you put it in the workforce. That's very different than somebody who came of age in the 1980s and was feeling like, we're going to conquer the world. The Cold War's at an end. There's all these emerging technologies. There's a new thing called the internet coming, right? And so I think it's good to sort of balance the common characteristics that we have and the realities of each of these different cohorts. Now, are there people who have grown up with a different set of technologies than what you and I grew up with? Man, I'm of a vintage. I remember getting off the couch, walking over, and choom choom choom. You got to turn a knob on the television to change channels, and there were only 3 or 4
Yeah.
channels.
Yeah.
Kind of frightens my kids when I talk about that. They're like,
Rabbit,
"Ah!"
rabbit ears sticking out of the top of the TV. Yeah, I was
Exactly,
right there.
exactly. But so now we've got people who are digitally native, right? They didn't have to learn what the interwebs were. They didn't have to think about being out of connection with other people, right? You carry a mobile device around now and you can be connected with anybody anywhere on earth who has a similar device. And so that will change certain things. The sort of availability of, I don't even want to call them role models, but images of what success looks like that could be very superficial. I think they're more prevalent, they're more frequent, you know, uh, and that does create sometimes a sense of constant fear of missing out or self judgment that says maybe I'm not advancing far enough. Maybe I'm not, maybe, should I have a Ferrari by now? You know,
Mm-hmm.
why isn't my six pack too, better defined? Oh, I got to go and do this. I think I just want to be aware that the number of inbound stimulus points that people who are starting their career today have grappled with is very different, and the content of those points of stimulus are very different than what I grew up with. And so I want to be cognizant of that because it'll play out then in conversations about career and progression and skill. And and I want to encourage people to to be courageous, to solve problems, to develop the grit that comes from failing at something rather than abandoning to go find something else that feels easy. And I think that there's enough of enough evidence out there that that level of grit and stick to itiveness deserves some attention and care. That's something as I manage teams, I'm cognizant of, and I try to help people who are early in their career understand that failure is not bad. Failure is just another way of learning,
100%. And maybe
and
the
it's
more
going to be
valuable.
okay. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a big part of what this podcast is about. Is we talk about successes, we talk about failures too, because we all, and I want to hear your story, and I want to hear because the story oftentimes I'll resonate with the story, and a story of failure can be whatever 10 times more valuable than a story of
yeah.
success. Especially if I feel it viscerally. I went to the AEM annual meeting here recently in Palm Springs. There was a young lady from Trend Hunters there. Her name was, I have to read it, so I'm looking away for a second. Armida Ascano. And she put on a wonderful presentation around the nuances of, we hear about, Gen Z, Gen X, millennials in between, boomers and things like that. But she has it. I'm going to put this for people on YouTube, and I'll put this in the show notes later. But she broke it down into 10 micro trends, and they took like Gen X, for example, and broke that into 2. And it was really, like the first digital natives and what that caused and how those people tend to see things a little differently, to your point. And I love what she spoke about. I love the understanding of where their predispositions are likely to be given the experiences they had. The 9/11 kids that grew up with that as their first big kick in the teeth,
Pandemic generation that spent
pandemic
2 years
generation.
not in school because of COVID, right?
Exactly. My kiddo, who was, out to enjoy college years, had to, enjoy college years from home, like so many other kids, right? And had that visceral experience of sort of being kind of abandoned by the institution, and how unfortunate. And that's going to live with them for as long as it lives with them. So having that predisposition, I think, is certainly valuable in understanding the humans working around us. But I love what you said around the what I think we can almost say like the universal truths of people appreciating being heard, trusted, empowered, this weaponizing empathy kind of a concept, where that comes from, the deep listening and creating space for people on the team. I feel like that can only benefit all of us, and it's going to make for better teams and more enjoyable jobs. And maybe that's one of my must-haves is to be in a environment where there is respect and there is trust and there is empowerment, where I do like the people I work with. If I'm going to show up somewhere, it's got to be that for me.
Yeah. And for me, that's, that's like step one. I've taken jobs where I walked in and my predecessor spent 6 months in the seat and had, 3, 4, 5 direct reports walk out. And so it's like, how do we establish enough commitment that we stop the attrition? How do we stabilize it? I've gone into other circumstances where people weren't quitting, but there was some toxicity. And you've got to be able to kind of get to the roots there and role model what better is like. So maybe I'm a glutton for punishment, but I kind of look at circumstances and say, I don't need that. I'm committed to establishing that. And so I'm okay if somebody says, we've got issues, I can go in and go, okay, well, I think I can help. Because if everything is tidy, with your Toro background, you've heard about landscaping and people mowing lawns and stuff. If you need a new yard put in, I'm happy to sort of go, okay, well, let's see what's important here. Where are we going to lay everything in? But if all you need is somebody to like mow the lawn and trim the edges, that's not me. I'm not optimized for maintenance and repetition.
I love it. I love it. There's AI and automation for that, right? So yeah, totally.
Theoretically.
Theoretically. And so I have one last question for you, and I want to take it kind of back to the beginning, and it has to do, I think we started talking about consulting and how you consulted in your corporate careers and you consulted as an actual consultant. I've done the same myself. And I'm curious about your perspective on the permanence and the value of permanence in that relationship. So having a startup kind of mindset or a turnaround or a fix it kind of an inclination, what is the need for team? Do you prefer, and this is a universal question, but is it more valuable to have a team to plug into for an ongoing basis and like work with that team and see that team grow and prosper? Or can somebody with a consultative mindset kind of come and go from different environments and sponge up the beauty of what's in it in the moment and then move to the next team? Well, how important is permanence to you?
I think that we all have to balance those factors for ourselves, and they can change over time. I would say for me, if anybody were to prowl my LinkedIn, you'll see that my record at any stretch with an organization is about 6.5 years, and I've done that a couple of times. I've done 5 years here and there, and I've done shorter stints. I did a gig in the '90s with Masterlock. I was there 2 years. We went through 3 presidents and 2 vice presidents of marketing. There was a lot of churn. So 2 years was a good run in that environment. The reality is, for me, the idea of working collectively does not require that we're all employed by the same person. So, when I'm in a corporate leadership role, I'm running a marketing group, I have a strength and an affinity for helping agency partners not feel like they're on the other side of a firewall. And, you and I first got to know each other in that kind of a service provider role.
Exactly.
But I view folks as, I'll use the phrase, welcome to the rebel force. We're here to go and get something done. And I take great joy in having people buy into the set of objectives that we're all clear on, and to understand how they're contributing to us getting there, and to being part of the network of people who are figuring out ways to get there. So that might mean that an ad agency and a consultant and a freelance creative person and a product management team and an insights team are all working a problem together. Now, if I'm in a consultative space, I may come at it from a slightly different position, but the more I can encourage that sense of cohesiveness and clarity, and the more I can encourage that kind of collaboration, the better impact I can have. And I'm comfortable, I mentioned earlier, putting myself out of a job at BP, but creating another one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in a consultative sense, I spent a period of time as essentially the chief marketing officer for an organization, but on a retained consulting relationship. And after 14, 15 months of doing it, had a conversation with the CEO and said, I don't think you need to pay me for this anymore. You need a director of marketing who's on staff. We've achieved together a lot. We've grown the business, we've grown LinkedIn followers, and we've got more inbound leads, and we've got a new cadence in terms of event engagement and things like that. Well, now we've got an operating model that can be replicated and evolved and optimized, but it's not a ground up build. And you would probably be better served by having somebody here full time rather than twice a month like me. And so that's what we did. And I still have a tremendous sense of fulfillment around that. And I think the last sentiment in that space I would say is, even where we think we're establishing something of permanence, the reality is, in the best of circumstances, we've established a sandbar of sanity amidst a sea of change and a challenge. And it is possible that for all the good we've done, one big wave can wipe that out. A change in CEO, a change in strategy, a change in financial results that is crisis level. All of a sudden, things can shift. And there's only so much resilience that we can put in, even where we think of it as a permanent role. And the ability to kind of recognize that we create this space, we create what feels like stability, but we're always subject to something else happening. And being able to, when it's time to sort of reinforce the sandbar and say, nope, we're still good, we're still here, we survived the storm, versus better get in the boat and go find the next one. I think that's probably a topic for a whole different podcast. But that's also, I think for me, a truism. As we move through our lives, career-wise, personal-wise, our circumstances evolve, our experiences and our sentiment evolves, our needs evolve. And so this idea of constantly, just as you talked about, I'm in the flow, I'm in the flow, I'm in the flow. I'm going to take a breath and step back. I'm going to look at the process, the circumstance, my own role, reassess, either recommit or maybe redirect. I think that's it's a good cadence to get into. Like, here we go, Muppet fashion, wandering along, Kermit wise, and then be like, okay, I got to stop now, and I got to think about it. Have I just gotten myself so deeply in a groove that I've lost sight of what's really working for me? Let me step back, step out, and reassess.
That's brilliant. I will join you on that sandbar of sanity, which, by the way, I wrote. If ever invited, I'll be on that team where one weaponizes empathy and creates trust and empowerment for the betterment of all on the team. That is just brilliant. So thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. And I'm sure the audience is going to get a one treat when they hear all these tips and tricks and tools and tactics and nuggets. So Gary Lancina, thanks for joining us on Channel Chatter.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Appreciate the opportunity. Be well.